We've previously spoken about the problem of the US budget deficit. And we've also talked about how the increasing size of the US budget deficit is forcing up the level of debt year by year. Now, we're going to talk about that for a little while again, and then we're going to go into what Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to attempt to do about it in their Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. So let's look at the level of the US budget deficit again. Up until about 2019, things were fairly stable in budget land. But what happened was at the beginning of the pandemic, the US budget deficit blew out from 5% of US GDP in 2019 to just under 14% of GDP in 2020. It was 13.94%. As that happened, the level of debt in the US, which was around about 80% of GDP, started to rise. We see that the deficit of 2020 was 13.94% of GDP. It slowed a little bit down to 2022 to just under 4% of GDP. And then Joe Biden and Kamala Harris started to build many of their long-term programs, the American Rescue Plan, as it was called, and inflation reduction. These included a lot of things which were basically programs which supported, say, union areas or other supporters of the Democratic Party. So from a deficit of 3.9% of GDP in 2022, the deficit expanded last year to 7.1% of GDP in 23, and again the same 7.6% of GDP in 2024. But that's not the problem. The problem is that there are continuing deficits built into the legislation, and those deficits are 7.3% in 2025, 6.7% in 2026, 6.2% in 2027, 6.2% in 2028, and 6% in 2029. Now, the problem of that is that when we look at the level of US debt, we can see that debt to GDP in the US was stable at around about 80% of GDP for the years from, say, 2012 to about 2018 and the beginning of 2019. But the expansion of budget deficits then caused the level of debt to GDP to rise. And it's that rising level of debt to GDP which Jay Powell was referring to when he said at the last Fed meeting that the path of the US debt was unsustainable. So what the International Monetary Fund forecasts that the net debt to GDP rose from 83% in 2019 to 97% in 2020, and that was with the budget deficit of 14% of GDP that year. They then stabilised at 97% of GDP and actually declined slightly to 93% of GDP in 2022. But the problem is with the continuing forward deficits that debt to GDP really takes off. It rises to 98% of GDP this year. Next year it rises to 101.7% of GDP. The year after that, 2026, it rises to 104% of GDP. In 27, it rises to 105.8% of GDP. And by 2029, it rises to 109% of GDP. As you can see, that steady rise in debt to GDP is what makes the debt unsustainable. So what has happened in recent weeks is that two gentlemen have come forward as part of an initiative of the Trump administration in an attempt to begin to reduce that deficit. And for the very first time, they've released a full statement of what they intend to do. Those two gentlemen are Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. And what they intend to do is generate reductions in the numbers of people working in in the US government and the size of the deficit that's required to finance working for those people. And as that deficit falls, that should reduce or stabilise the US debt to GDP. There is a long commentary by both of them in the Wall Street Journal, but we'll just sample a few paragraphs of what they said so you can understand where they think they're going. Firstly, they're not actually going to be employed by the government. They're working without pay. They say, we will serve as outside volunteers, not federal officials or employees. Unlike government commissions or advisory committees, we won't just write reports or cut ribbons, we'll cut costs. We are assisting the Trump transition team to identify and hire a lean team of small government crusaders, including some of the sharpest technical and legal minds in America. This team will work with the new administration closely with the White House Office of Management and Budget. So it's that responsibility to the White House Office of Management and Budget and the resulting effects upon the Office of Management and Budget is how they generate benefit. The commentary goes on. The two of us will advise the Department of Government Efficiency at every step to pursue three kinds of major reform: regulatory rescissions, that is to say reducing regulation, administrative reductions and cost savings. You will see as we go through their commentary how reducing regulations, they reduce the number of employees the government has to have to enforce those regulations, and therefore they reduce budget spending and therefore reduce the budget deficit. That's how this works. They say we will focus particularly on driving change through executive action based on existing legislation rather than passing new laws. They go on. DOGE will present this list of regulations that we want to act upon to President Trump, who can, by executive action, immediately pause the enforcement of those regulations and initiate the process of review and rescission, by which they mean cutting those regulations. This would liberate individuals and businesses from illicit regulations never passed by Congress and would in turn stimulate the economy. When the president nullifies thousands of such regulations, critics will allege executive overreach, they say. But in fact, it will be correcting executive overreach of thousands of regulations promulgated by administrative fiat that were never authorised by Congress. They go on, a dramatic reduction in federal government regulations provides sound industrial logic for mass headcount reductions across the federal bureaucracy. DOGE intends to work with embedded appointees in agencies to identify the minimum number of employees at an agency for it to perform its constitutionally permissible and statutory mandated functions. The number of federal employees to cut should at least be proportional to the number of federal regulations which are nullified. Not only are fewer employees required to enforce fewer regulations, but the agency would produce fewer regulations once its scope of authority is properly limited. They go on, but even without relying on the view that DOGE will help end federal overspending by taking arm at the $500 billion plus in annual federal expenditures that are unauthorised by Congress, but just done by the administrative state, or being used in ways that Congress has never intended, from $535 billion a year to the corporation to public broadcasting and the $1.5 billion for grants to international organisations to nearly $300 million to progressive groups like Planned Parenthood. So what the program of DOGE is to identify regulations which were put in place purely by the action of the administrative state, remove those regulations, and as they remove those regulations, they take away the necessity for the employees who are enforcing those regulations And as those employees retire from their burden, then the reduction in federal spending will reduce the size of the budget deficit. And their report on all of this will be finished by the middle of 2026, slightly after or around the 4th of July 2026, which will be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the beginning of a national celebration of that anniversary.